Well, I think it's safe to say that the story we just heard from John's Gospel is one that we all know. We're all familiar with Jesus changing water into wine. And I would say even non-Christians are familiar with that story. Okay, now, in John's Gospel, that miracle, Jesus changing the water into wine, is known as the first sign. Sign is the word that John uses, and that essentially is a miracle. Now, John's Gospel is my favorite of the four canonical Gospels because there's just so much going on. And every time I read the Gospel of John, I notice something that I hadn't noticed before. And that's pretty impressive, I would say. And scholars like to break John's Gospel into four sections or books. The first, Mary, our candidate for the diaconate a few weeks ago, taught us about the prologue. That's the first section. And that's the section where we're told who Jesus is, the Son of God, the Word made flesh. Now, there's a crabby old nun who teaches Johannian literature in Berkeley at seminary. And as she likes to say, Jesus knows everything in the Gospel of John. And he does. And we're told that right up front, that Jesus knows everything in the Gospel of John. And now we move on to the second book, the book of the signs. And the book of the signs outlines Jesus' earthly ministry. And it talks about his travels from place to place. And of course, it includes the signs that Jesus performs. The third section is the book of glory, and that tells of Jesus' return to his heavenly kingdom, including the Last Supper, his arrest, his crucifixion, his resurrection. And the final section is the epilogue. And the epilogue tells us that the entire book of the Gospel of John was written so that we might believe. Now, in the book of signs, since that's where we are right now, there are seven signs that appear in the Gospel of John. Of course, the changing water into wine, we know that's first. Jesus also heals an official's son. That's the second sign. The healing of the paralytic person is the third sign. The feeding of the multitudes. The walking on the water. The healing of the man who was blind since birth. And of course, probably the most famous, Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. Now, as we said, the gospel concludes with the epilogue. And that tells us in the epilogue that there are many more signs that were not printed in the book. It doesn't mean there were only 7. Those are the 7 that were printed in the book. And why were they printed in the book? Well, they were included so that you might believe. That's what we're told in the end of the Gospel of John. And since we're hearing today from the book of signs, I think it's probably important that we explore that a little bit and try to figure out what it means to have a sign. Because the signs, after all, are, as the epilogue tells us, intended to make sure that we can believe. So let's explore that a little bit together. I remember when I was a kid, I had a fascination with magic shows. And every year, I would wait with anticipation for the annual television special by a magician named David Copperfield. And my favorite part of David Copperfield's annual magic show on television was when he would step away from his live audience and do a magic trick for the viewers at home. Now, we'd go up to the screen, and he'd have us touch certain icons on the screen, and the goal of that trick was he was going to find where we would end up at the end of the trick. Now, I grew up in a family with 3 kids, and as you can imagine, that means that there was a fight over who got to go up to the screen and do the magic trick with David Copperfield. And we resolved that eventually by each of us going into different rooms to do the trick at the same time. Okay? And then, of course, we all know that meant that we would fight over who got to use the biggest TV screen. Okay? Which, by the way, in those days was a 35-incher. That was the big TV in those days. And that would be dwarfed by the TVs that we probably all have in our homes now. But the cool thing about this magic trick was that eventually David Copperfield would find us, even if our answers to the questions he asked were different. Now, if he would say, move the number of spaces that correspond to the number of years old you are, well, my answer is probably different than yours. Or if he'd say, move the number of spaces that corresponds to the number of letters in your favorite color, well, there's a different number of letters in the word red than there is in the word purple. How did he do it? He found us every time, even if our answers were different. And I also remember one special where David Copperfield made the Statue of Liberty disappear. That was impressive. Now, I can assure you the Statue of Liberty is still there. I saw it just a few weeks ago. It's there. And I also remember Siegfried and Roy in a television special in 1988 at Disneyland. And Siegfried and Roy made Cinderella's castle disappear. And imagine me being a little kid at the time, feeling completely distraught because I hadn't yet been to Disneyland, and now the castle, the most notable landmark in Disneyland, was gone. Again, the castle is still there, I assure you. Now, I got to admit to you, even today, even in adulthood, I still enjoy magic. And about a year ago, I dragged my wife Brandy to a magic show. We went and saw my favorite magicians, Penn and Teller. Okay, so I've got kind of a guilty pleasure when it comes to watching magic. Now, something interesting about Penn and Teller is that Penn and Teller frequently break something called the magician's code. They tell you how certain tricks are done. But they also, at the same time, use humor and misdirection to perform an even more challenging trick that they don't tell you the answers to. And Penn and Teller, if you've seen them, you know they put on a pretty impressive show. Now, one other thing you may or may not know about Penn and Teller is that they are pretty staunch atheists. They don't believe in God. And they're very blunt about that. They're very blunt about their non-belief in God. And I can't say I hold that against them necessarily, because we all have the autonomy to discern our faith practices. Everyone gets to choose how we live into our faith. But if you ask them to tell you why they don't believe, it's because these signs, like the signs that we heard about today, are essentially meaningless to them, because they can perform these kinds of signs as well. That's what they tell us. Now, for a magician, changing water into wine is not a big deal. It's pretty easy to do. Watch this. Get your cameras ready. That's a good vintage. It's not that hard to do. Okay. And walking on water is also not that hard to do, because walking on water can be accomplished by strategically placing stones just under the surface of the water, where at your eye level, the refraction would make those stones invisible. And speaking of Disneyland, which we mentioned earlier, you ever notice, if you've been there, that the water in the rivers is green and cloudy? The reason that water is green is because it hides the track that the boat sails on. So when you ride the boat on the river at Disneyland, you're not actually riding on a real boat. I hate to break it to you. You're riding on a vehicle that is moving along a track that you can't see because it's hidden by the green color of the water. I do assure you, however, that the castle is indeed still there. So here's the question. If it's so easy to do that, what's the difference between a magic trick and a sign? Okay. I think we get some of the answers in today's story, where we hear about the first sign. Jesus' mother, who by the way is never named in John's gospel. Did you notice that? Jesus' mother is never given the name Mary. She's always referred to as the mother of Jesus. But anyway, the mother of Jesus comes to Jesus and says, we have a problem here. All the wine is gone. Okay, now some of our young people can attest to this. Mothers are famous for encouraging their children to do things that maybe we don't always want to do. Can you attest to that, Brooklyn? Does that happen? So your mom sometimes asks you to do things you don't want to do? Yeah. How about you, Delilah? Does that happen? Do you sometimes get asked to do things you don't want to do? Put your shoes away and things like that? Does that happen sometimes? Yeah, I think so. I think that happens to all of us. My mother, for instance, always makes me say grace when we get together for a family meal. Well, you're the priest after all. So just like in that situation, Jesus' mother wants him to go to work on his day off. And she says to him, well, you're the Son of God. Go fix this. Now, if this were some kind of a magic trick, Jesus would have jumped up from his seat and said, hey, everybody, watch this. Right? Because performing magic is a show. It's a demonstration. He probably would have put on a television special. And he probably would have put on a stage performance. Because magic is a performance. But Jesus didn't want to do that sign just yet. Just like I'm sure some of us, right? Or just like when my mom asks me to say grace at the meal, Jesus, I imagine, was kind of whiny. Do we get whiny, Delilah? Do you get whiny? How about you, Brooklyn? Do you get whiny when mom asks you to do something you don't want to do? I get whiny. I can picture Jesus saying, Mom, I don't want to do that. Okay? But he does it anyway. So none of Jesus' signs are performative. Instead, these signs were, as we call them, signs. And what does a sign do? That's the question. What does a sign do? We're in the process right now of building a new sign out in front of our building here. And we all know those electronic signs when we're driving along the freeway that tell us something, right? They have a different message every day. Those signs have a purpose. And what about the signs that tell us, go that way if you want to go to Los Angeles, or go that way if you want to go to Tucson? Right? Those signs give us some information. What signs do is they give us direction, and they point us to where it is that we need to be. Our St. John's sign that we're building is going to point people to St. John's. A sign saying Los Angeles that-a-way points us to Los Angeles. Okay? Jesus' signs in the Gospel of John point us to God. And we know it isn't a magic trick because the wine was the good stuff. Okay? A magic trick, I hate to break it to you, doesn't really turn water into wine. It turns this clear liquid into this red liquid, right? But it ain't wine. It ain't wine. Okay? And Penn and Teller's magic tricks might be entertaining, but they don't really point us to anything. Signs and symbols are important to us in our faith lives. And they aren't magic tricks. They're not for our entertainment. They're for our salvation. They're for our relationships with God and with one another. A sign here, an example of a sign here at St. John's is that milk can that's sitting right there. Okay? We don't like to abuse the milk can because it's so powerful a sign. When St. John's feels like we couldn't possibly scrape together another $1, that milk can makes an appearance, and we end up getting whatever it is that we need. It's out today, by the way, for fire victims in Southern California, so your generosity is, of course, appreciated. But the power of that milk can points us to God. It isn't magical, it's mystical. And there are a lot of mystical signs here at St. John's and in the world. Signs that point us to God. Now, they might not be signs that slap us in the face and get our attention, but they're there. Those signs are there. Now, last week, Father Harry reminded us to listen to the voice of God and also to be discerning about that voice when we hear that voice. Is that voice really God, or is it maybe me convincing myself that it's God so that I can do what it is that I want to do? Well, today we're going to continue on that theme because God's voice can indeed be heard. And his message and his signs can indeed be seen. We have to do our part too. We have to pay attention. We have to pay attention. Do we see, for instance, the presence of God in the face of a smiling child? Because I do. Do we see the presence of God in the success we've had so far in our capital campaign that many of us doubted was a possibility? I do. Do we see the presence of God in our shared ministry together? A shared ministry that brought a young, goofy priest to become rector at a parish where many of the people here are twice his age. I do. There's a whole lot of love in this place. And love is a sign. It's a sign that points us to God. The wedding feast at Cana that we just heard about was not a magic show. It was an example of Jesus' love for his mother and also for us. A message so that we might believe. Just as we keep our hearts and ears open to hear the voice of God, may we also continue to keep our eyes open so that we might continue to recognize those signs. And when we recognize those signs, let's do our part to make sure that other people have an opportunity to see them as well. Amen.